A pleasant good afternoon and welcome to our ZoomMate participants. I am Stephen Reyes, Head of Treasury Sales, and I will be your moderator for today's economic briefing titled Economic and Financial Markets Update, COVID-19 Lockdown, Opportunities and Risks. Before we proceed, a few house rules. Your devices will be kept on silent mode for the duration of the briefing. Should you have any questions, please feel free to send over your questions via the Q&A section at the bottom of your app, and we shall respond to them during the briefing or post-briefing via email. We hope that you will find this second session enlightening and thought-provoking. Allow me to begin by thanking each and every one of you for attending this unique gathering where we hope we can provide you valuable insights that will answer your questions and help you make informed decisions for your needs. We truly appreciate your making time to participate and join us in this virtual forum. We are now on the third week post-ECQ MECQ, conducting our second virtual briefing for our clients. COVID transmission in the Philippines stands at 27,000 and death at 1,100, while global levels has breached the 8 million mark with death at roughly around 440,000. Following the general lifting of hard lockdowns in most countries, save maybe Brazil, India, and Pakistan, most countries have already seen a flattening of the curve. We now closely monitor whether indeed the lifting of the lockdown was a case of a flattened transmission scenario or was it a case of an economy needing to open. A choice between life or the economy. A time also to assess whether the sporadic recovery we are now seeing is true or only temporary. Our briefing will give you an insight as to where we currently stand and what we are seeing in governments, particularly our own, in preparing for life post-lockdown. Are we headed for the much anticipated sustained recovery, or are we headed for a relapse? Are we to expect a Nike-shaped recovery, a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped recovery, or a W recovery? With this background, and to take us into the briefing proper, allow me to introduce our boss, President and CEO of RCBC, Mr. Eugene Acevedo, to give the welcome remarks.
Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me well. This is the only time I'm wearing a blazer because otherwise we're working in the office in casual attire. I'm really so happy to join you today. I know many of you are in your homes. I just want to wish you this early safety and peace of mind. Let me share with you how I feel about this situation and maybe give you some idea of how we're coping. I have to be very honest with you. At this point, I feel, for lack of a better word, very realistic about the situation, but very hopeful as well. Let me tell you why. It's really because we've figured out a plan, and I'd like to share with you the plan that we have because I think you might have yours as well. But when we worked out this plan, this was not because we sat down together and held hands and figured this out. No, it was really because we listened to people, and two of the webinars that were very helpful were webinars from McKinsey and Harvard Business School. Let me share with you what we learned and what we're putting together. It's a mix of, it's like basketball. It's a mix of defense and offense. On the defense side, we're doing what we can to make sure absolutely that it's lives before livelihoods. Our people need to be protected, and we have very strict rules. Not everybody follows them. Gets to my temper sometimes, but we have to do our best to make sure they're safe. The second thing we're doing is that we're radically cutting costs. Revenues are going to come down, margins are going to come down. We have to cut costs, and we have to cut at least 10% for this year and cutting capex as well. The third thing we're doing that we're classifying as defense is we're spending a lot of time with our customers to help them figure out their cash flows. I know it's difficult, but I think it's also important that you have a very realistic view of what your cash flows will be for the next 6 months, the next 2 years. And we will help you. Don't worry about whether we're going to be helping you or not. We will. Just make sure that you go through the exercise of figuring out your cash flows, your revenue position, and do your own cost cutting and whatever that is that you need to do for your company. We will help you. Now that's the defense part. On the offense part, well, I'll start with digital. Nobody wants to go to branches. Branch volume has come down. Transaction count has come down 50, 60%. It's probably improved a bit recently, but it's still down by a lot. Nobody wants to go to branches. However, on the other hand, the amount of the transaction count and the value of electronic payments have gone up through the roof by a lot. The number of people migrating to mobile apps has been in hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions if you add up the whole industry. And the number of corporates who are sending money via electronic channels instead of checks has also risen. This has been a massive change because people just can't get out of their homes. Many treasury groups of companies can't even pay because they're incomplete. They can't do maker checker, accountants are not there, and all sorts of complicated things. That's the first. The second offense we're doing is we're realizing that this may not be the best time to acquire new customers, but we will try to do more business with existing customers. That's our focus. It's difficult to go out and get new ones because we don't have their history. We don't know what's going to be happening, or we don't know what's happening to their credit state at this point in time. So we're trying to do whatever we can with our existing base. Our focus specifically is to make sure that our existing base of customers also gets to be in a position to transform their businesses. What do I mean by that? Markets have changed, customers have changed, even our employees have changed. We need to change the way we do things. And most of the solutions related to that are digital in nature. Those are exactly the type of solutions that we can help you with. So please have that conversation with your relationship manager and don't worry too much. We're here to help you. Thank you very much for joining us. And I hope we'll have another session in the future. This is our second. If we have a third one, I hope you join us as well, and we'll be comparing notes with you then. Thank you, and I'll pass it back on to our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our president. It's always nice to have you whenever we have these interactions with our clients, where you share your insights, at least, and your plans to our clients. I would now like to introduce our guest, our speaker for today. To deliver the RCBC economic briefing is a familiar face. He is the chief economist of RCBC and a frequent resource person at various media companies and TV shows. He is once again awarded one of the best economists by The Asset for 2020. And here to give us his views, Mr. Mike Ricafort.
Okay, pleasant afternoon to everyone. Thanks so much, Stephen, for the generous introduction. So we'd like to update you with the first, we'll concentrate on the post-lockdown scenario, the recovery story or the rebound story. Now, let us start with the outlook. We now see GDP by -2 to -4%. So, well, if you compare it, the Philippine economy has been relatively resilient. It has grown by at least 6% from 2012 to 2019. So, how does this compare? the Philippines is still relatively doing better because other Asian countries are expected to crack by -5 to -10%. And some developed countries could even decline as much as -10 to -15% at least. So with that, the Philippine economy being one of the fastest growing, so that still shows some consistency of the resilience. In fact, despite this projection, uh, well, the Japan Credit Rating Agency already gave an A credit rating to the Philippines, despite all these challenges that we have on COVID-19. S&P also affirmed the credit rating of the Philippines at 2 notches above investment grade. Despite all of this, those are signs of resilience, despite the downgrades that we have been seeing all over in many other countries. So therefore, we look at now, we have seen gains also. So much money has been made so far since our last briefing with you. We now see the exchange rate ranging between 49.50 to 50.50. Now it's at a little over 50 levels. That's still among the strongest in 2 years. Inflation would remain relatively low or benign, so at a little over 2%. So therefore, interest rates, that's already the fair value of interest rates. Interest rates cannot fundamentally go down below inflation that easy. There may be exceptions in other countries, but generally, that's a fundamental rule. That's the reason why interest rates were invented. So we see the BSP key policy rate currently at 2.75. It could be still cut by another, at least a quarter for the rest of the year. Because short-term interest rates right now are a little over 2%. But maybe we have seen already the best for both inflation and interest rates. We have already seen some uptick, healthy upward correction, about 10 to 15 basis points in local interest rates, especially yesterday. And they're already the highest in about a month. But nonetheless, these are still low levels, meaning the lowest in 3.5 to 7 years. So that's still relatively attractive for borrowers. And on the trading perspective, investors have made so much money already. We have seen the yields, the long-term interest rates easing by 200 basis points, or some on a trading perspective, that's 20% gains already in just 3 months' time. Short-term interest rates have gone down by more than 100 basis points. So from the point of view of the borrowers, they're saving money already at this point. That's for short-term tenors. But for long-term interest rates, they have gone down already by 200 basis points over the past 3 months in view of the latest easing measures by the central bank. So they have made so much, they have saved so much money already. Should they decide to borrow anytime soon? Interest rates in the US, the Fed rates, expected to remain zero, as signaled by the Fed officials for the next 2 to 3 years. As the chairman of the Fed has pointed out, that it would take a long time for the US economy to go back to pre-COVID-19 levels. But nonetheless, the Fed already pointed out that the US economy has already bottomed out. For the PSEI, this is rather optimistic. We're looking at 7 to 7.5. Currently, it's a little over 6,000, around 6,200. It has gone up already by more than 50%. So it came from a low of 4,000 3 months ago. So a lot of money has been made already at this point. So expect some consolidation initially towards 6,000 or a little less than 6,000 before some base building, before we see further gain. But we have to take note, whenever these levels reach towards the pre-COVID-19 levels, so there's some immediate rationalization by investors, meaning some profit taking could emerge, as well as those who have held or were stuck with their positions may consider lightening up if they try to go back to those levels. Why are the markets gaining? Because there's so much liquidity right now. It's central bankers have learned their lessons in the past crisis periods by cutting interest rates and infusing a lot of liquidity. Okay, next slide, please. So let me walk you over. So the consensus now, these are all supporting slides on the summary that I just gave. So the consensus is for a decline of -2 to -4. That's consistent with our view for this year. And for next year, it would be a strong rebound between 7 to 9%. So that would be because of the low base, but it would take a long while. The preferred scenario is a U-shaped recovery, meaning it would take at least 1 to 2 years before we go back to pre-COVID levels. In fact, it may be much longer for some industries, like tourism industry, and those industries involving big ticket items. It may even take around 3 years before they see a recovery to pre-COVID levels. Next slide, please. So let me just walk you over. So here are the catalysts right now, as mentioned. So the markets are also waiting for any developments on possible cure or vaccine that could speed up economic growth. We also have recent geopolitical risk factors like the U.S.-China tensions, as well as the China-India tensions, as well as renewed hostilities on the Korean Peninsula that could add up to the slower economic growth and slower recovery going forward. Next slide, please. So this is an elaboration of the credit rating that we mentioned a while ago. So expect the improved credit rates of the Philippines. Well, this came much earlier, the A rating by JCR, by Japan's credit rating agency. So that would attract more foreign investments into the country. That partly explains the gains that we have been having, on top of the liquidity-driven gains due to the easing measures by the central banks. Okay, next slide, please. So total losses already officially by the Philippine economic team for the 45-day, this is just for 45-day ECQ. That's a little over 1 trillion. So we're estimating around 2 trillion for the whole year. If we take into account also the slower or the gradual rebound of the economy because of the need for social distancing measures, as COVID is still there. One of the reasons why the economy has been reopened, primarily because the government has run out of funds for social amelioration. It's only good for 2 months. So that's why there's a need to open the economy so people can work again and rely less on dollars or subsidies. Okay, next slide, please. So we have seen some closures also, and as well as job losses. But this is expected even during normal times. As technology evolves, there's the so-called constant need for attrition or to rationalize and able to stay competitive. That's the bottom line. It just happened now that we have this COVID-19. Okay, next slide, please. And here's the rest of the list. Some of them even started before COVID, before the outbreak here locally. Okay, next slide, please. So oil prices have already recovered to pre-COVID levels, the highest in about 3.5 months. Okay, so maybe we have seen already the best in inflation, as I pointed out earlier. Okay, next slide, please. So interest rates, maybe it would be hard for it to go down any further. We have seen already some upward correction. Even for the 3-month now, it's close to 2.20. It came from almost 2%. So it's already cheap for the borrowers right now. Okay. Next slide, please. Same goes for the 10-year tenor. It's already among the highest in a month. It has bottomed out already because interest rates cannot really sustain below inflation rate, especially long-term inflation expectations. So one of the best times to borrow already for those with deep pockets. Now they have saved so much money already at this point, 200 basis points compared to 3 months ago. Okay, next slide, please. So this is what I've been talking about. The valuation of interest rates, it cannot go down below inflation, currently at 0.1%. Okay, next slide, please. As pointed out here, so some of the short-term interest rates have already gone above the 2.1% inflation rate. Okay, next slide, please. So this is how we see inflation. So it would linger at a little over 2%. Maybe, okay, next slide, 2.2% for the next couple of months from 2.1%. Okay, next slide, please. Even rice and ply prices have already started to go up. So alongside with oil. So therefore, maybe we have already seen the best for both inflation and maybe the best also for interest rates. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the retail price of rice. It has gone up already, alongside with the world prices. Okay, next slide, please. So there's so much money already in the financial system. It's already more than 1 trillion, parked with the BSP, ODF, and TDF. It only came from 400 billion at the start of the line. Because reserve requirement at 200 basis points at 100 billion, and the national government borrowed from the BSP 300 billion to repurchase of government securities. We have seen matured government securities more worth about 200 billion, as well as other easing measures by the central bank. So there's so much money in the system right now that sustained relatively low interest rates recently. Next slide. As people are more conservative and holding on to more cash as their spending has been reduced by both businesses and households. So the best exchange rate, it's among the best levels in 2 years. At a little over 50, it reached 49.80 about nearly 2 weeks ago. So we're moving towards the importation season. So it has bottomed out for the meantime. Importation season really comes maybe for a lot of you, a lot of our corporate clients. So some of the importation would come in the third quarter, so in less than 2 months. Okay, next slide, please. So the local stock market, there's so much money made already, more than 50% from the lows. And the next resistance is around 6,600 to 6,700. So it has to consolidate first to be more sustainable, because from April 6 to about 2 weeks ago, it only ranged between 5,400 to 5,700. And less than 2 weeks ago, it started to rally again alongside with the rest of the global markets with the opening of the economies. Okay, next slide, please. Even the price to book ratios have already gone up lately to the highest in 3 months. These are already pre-COVID-19 levels. So investors would tend to rationalize, as I have been pointing out early on. Okay, it would take a while again for it to sustain at much higher levels, especially at 7,000 levels. Okay, next slide, please. So much money has been made already. Even the irrelatively comparable, here's the fiscal or stimulus measures. For the Philippines, it's 3% of GDP. So, okay, the government already mentioned that it only has 180 billion available funds. Next slide, please. Even the deficit to GDP already at 8% levels. So, because the threshold is around 9%. So, meaning the government cannot fund any additional stimulus measures anymore. That's why the economy has to reopen as well. And there's also the need for greater monetary easing measures. Okay, next slide, please. So, as mentioned, these are the economic growth estimates. So, the Philippines is still relatively better. Okay, next slide, please. And also the debt to GDP ratio, for the Philippines, if it goes to 50%, maybe that's already the acceptable level. And we already saw the credit upgrade on the Philippines. Next slide, please. So we have seen the biggest line in import. This record started in 1980. It's down by 60%. Precisely, this is unprecedented. The lockdown or the closure of a large part of the economy. Okay, next slide, please. So anyhow, we'll be providing you also copies of these, because there are constraints on logistics as well as on supply chain. So that's expected, not only here in the Philippines, but for the rest of the world, as shown here. Okay, next slide, please. As well as exports. Exports declined by 50%. That's a similar rate. So we have seen, despite exports being a priority sector, some export items declined also by as much as 60 to 80%. Next slide, please. So consistently, manufacturing, we also saw some similar performances. In the essential industries like food manufacturing, the best performers, they declined by at least 40%. considering that some of them are allowed to operate during the lockdown. Because precisely, there's a sharp slowdown in economic activity by spending by both businesses and households and other institutions. Okay, next slide, please. So this is for manufacturing sales, so also in a similar fashion. Both production and sales declining by similar extent. Okay, next slide, please. And capacity utilization also sharply declined to 70%. So this is unprecedented. Hopefully, okay, we may have seen not so good data for imports, exports, and manufacturing, but they would maybe, hopefully, this is already the worst. The worst of the lockdown around April. The economy started to partially open around the latter part of May when the ECQ was eased in Metro Manila, and it was further relaxed to GCQ. So there were more industries that were allowed to operate. Hopefully, this would already pick up. We have seen already the worst of these data that we have just seen. So some pick up already, but realistically, the recovery or the rebound will be gradual. Next slide, please. Same goes with unemployment. At the height of it, as of April, it went up to 17%, precisely because a lot of businesses are not operating. Next slide, please. And this is the final slide of the first part of the presentation. So capital expenditures have already declined by as much as, about around 40 to 50% for some industries. So this is already hindsight because of the 2-month lockdown. It's even more than 2 months actually. So it's already hindsight. It's just adjusting to that. So it translated to also less demand for financing and reduced economic activities. So this is part of the adjustments by businesses. New normal after the reopening. And the economic rebound may not be that fast because the risk of COVID-19 infections is still there, the risk of the second round or the second wave. So that's why a lot of measures are in place, and it's still partial capacity on the economy. It could range between 30 to 50%. And but it won't, as long as we don't see yet a vaccine or a cure, it would be a slow recovery for the rest of the year. So this is the end of the first part of the presentation. And let me now turn you over to our moderator, Stephen. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mike, for that very informative presentation. Following things caught my attention during your presentation, and you said U-shape rates may have already bottomed or are bottoming out. 7,000 for the physics, a rating upgrade from JCR or the Japan Credit Rating Agency, and that there are tons of liquidity in the system. All right, so we'll keep that in mind later on as we go to our Q&A. Before we move on to your special presentation on the Corporate Recovery and Tax Incentive for Enterprises Act Bill or CREATE Bill, I'd like to interject a question to you. I've been itching to ask you this question. Was the opening of our economy and subsequent lifting of ECQ, in your opinion, a case of COVID transmission flattening, or was it a case of the economy needing to open to avert a more damaged economy?
Stephen, it's more of the latter. It's about the economy, because we haven't really seen yet a flattening of cases. In fact, it even increased, as you mentioned a while ago. Maybe for the past 2 to 3 weeks, we've been seeing maybe an average of close to 500 infections per day. So, but looks like that since there's no more funding for additional stimulus, as already explained by the government economic team, so there's a need now for the economy to reopen or to restart. In fact, it's not just us. It's coincidentally, many other countries right now have started to reopen as well their respective economies, led by the US, countries in Europe, especially the hard-hit ones. So primarily, because businesses must go on, it cannot. The government has limited resources for social amelioration or the dole-outs. It's only good for 2 months or 200 billion. It only has 180 billion pesos left. In fact, the pending bill in Congress, it's worth 1.3 trillion of stimulus package. The economic team has been candid and frank about it. We don't have money to fund that. So that's why the economy and the businesses have to reopen. People have to work again. So they'll have wages, salaries, and livelihood as well as businesses. And the government will be able to collect more taxes. So it's really more of that. That's why it's very important now to have these social distancing measures and other stringent measures to prevent further. Because the curve, we have yet to see a flattening of the COVID-19 curve.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Mike. That was Mike just telling us, still practice social distancing. Be careful and take care of ourselves. All right. So now we will enter the second phase of the presentation of Mike. Like I said, he will be talking about corporate recovery and tax incentive for enterprises Act Bill or Create Bill. This is a program of government which I suppose they are preparing for the final phase of the crisis. The three phases of the crisis that's been discussed is contraction, which we already saw, transition, which we are under, and the final phase will be recovery. And I suppose the Create Bill is intended for the recovery phase. So Mike, take over. Please present Create Bill.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephen. So the Create Bill is positioned to be the biggest stimulus measure by the Philippine government, not only for this year, but in the years to come. This is one way to address, well, it's addressing so many important issues right now. As we're now moving into the reopening of the economies. We're already past the worst of the lockdowns. Hopefully, no more second or even third wave, and the recovery would already pick up. So the key highlight of this will see an immediate reduction in corporate income tax rate. From the current 30%, it would be accelerated to 25%. So when would this happen? Originally, before the recess of the sessions by Congress, the original plan is to approve this by the early part of June and for implementation as early as July. Now, the senators already apologized. They have this statement by saying that they would tackle this again upon the opening of Congress, the sessions. It would reopen by the time of SONA by President Duterte on July 27. So the senators pledged to tackle it by August. So therefore, the earliest implementation would be around September to October at the earliest. So that would mean 42 billion pesos. You would see already the corporations, especially a lot of you maybe, or almost all of you, are clients, are corporate clients. So you will see right away an outright reduction in your corporate income taxes to 25%. So you'll be saving 5%. That's this is positioned to be the biggest stimulus measure. It would require 42 billion pesos this year for the year. That's the initial estimate. And for the next couple of years, the corporate income tax starting 2023, it will be reduced by 1 percentage point per year until it reaches 20% by 2027. So we will see lower corporate income taxes. So it will help a lot of us in the corporate sector. We'll see more income at your disposal to help us, to help all of us. Whether and cope with this COVID-19 pandemic, especially the lockdowns that just came. So other salient features, there will be a 2-year extension of the sunset provisions. It would also address the foreign investors that are now enjoying incentives from the government. So there will be 2-year extension to 4 to 9 years from the current 2 to 7 years. So because incentives will be reviewed eventually. As well as the null cost, they call it, net operating loss carryover. So it would be extended by 2 years from the current 3 years to 5 years. Okay, now next slide, please. So this is the schedule. Actually, this is really not the first time that this is proposed. If you heard the City Bill, this was the predecessor of the Create Bill. But now the terms are more generous for businesses. So it would also provide relief for businesses, particularly the corporations. Now, as well as this would hopefully attract more investments into the country. Because while the Citira bill has been pending for the past 1 to 2 years or so, some foreign investors have been waiting on the sidelines before they become more decisive in putting more investments into the country, create more jobs and other business opportunities. So hopefully, the Create Bill will all address that. Okay, next slide, please. So these are the conditions. I have also had conversations with DOF officials about this. So these are the conditions. These are very similar to the Citira bill. But now, as I said, there would be more concessions as it's really positioned stimulus. So before that, other than the Create Bill, the important stimulus measure, there are 2 pillars: Create Bill and what's readily available right now, increase infrastructure spending that would create more jobs. So hand in hand, both of which would be a critical part of the economic recovery or rebound, especially now with the reopening of the economy. So expect also a lot of infrastructure, construction, and other allied and related industries, those in supply chain and value chain of the big infrastructure projects. So this would, with the Create Bill, would also help that at the same time. So it's performance-based, meaning there are specific targets of the granting of, especially on incentives. It's also targeted, meaning where investments are needed most, especially in the rural areas, and able to expedite economic development, as well as the jobs that they create, as mentioned by the first 2 criteria. And it's time-bound, meaning, because as they have been pointing out, the economic team has been pointing out, Philippines is I think it's maybe the only country with open-ended incentives. So they would try to rationalize that, not necessarily putting an end, but there will be a periodic review of the investment incentives. So if they meet the basic criteria, the industries that still fall within the requirements would be able to continuously enjoy the incentives, especially the job creation, the export targets, improvement in productivity, and so on, especially if these industries indeed still need support from the government. And it's also transparent. They'll try to disclose from time to time the incentives as well as the beneficiary investors or companies. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the timeline as we have seen a while ago. So immediately, the earliest now, it's been the time that we'll see the 25% tax, corporate income tax reduction. So I think it will go down to 25% from 30% outright. So it may come in the latter part of the 3rd quarter year. So it's still the same by next year until 2022. By 2023, it will become 24%. Then in the subsequent years, decrements of 1 percentage point until it reaches 20%. So a decline in corporate income tax rate of 10 percentage points in just 7 years. So hopefully that would help. This is well, being the biggest stimulus measures. This will help companies to at least keep employment or jobs and even create more jobs, especially if we already fully recover. Hopefully in at least 1 to 2 years, or even by the third year, hopefully we're back to pre-COVID levels, and the lower corporate income taxes would help accelerate more investments and create more employment, and the bigger picture, more business opportunities and faster economic growth. Okay, next slide, please. And this ends the presentation on the CREATE bill. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much, Mike, for your discussion on Create Bill. I know that the origin of this was called PIFITA. So maybe later on we can discuss further what made PIFITA seemed a little bit more controversial versus the Create Bill. Okay, guys. Right now, if you would indulge us, allow us first to segue a bit as our team prepares for the Q&A. Give us some time and allow us to have our self-proclaimed Iron Man and head of global transaction banking, Mr. Manny Narciso, to talk to you on developments in their area. Sir Manny?
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for that very flattering introduction. All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to begin by recalling something our CEO said earlier, which is things have changed. Digital is coming to the fore, and we will help you. We can help you, and we will help you. And I'm calling this portion financial management in the strange new normal. And I call it strange largely because from where I'm sitting, I'm looking out at EDSA, and traffic is moving at 3:45 in the afternoon. It's normal. I'll accept that as the normal, but it's not familiar. It's really quite strange. And how we adapt to this is something I'd like to talk about, particularly when it comes to managing operating funds. Okay, next slide. So let's begin by showing you a picture. This is not a HPG checkpoint. This is actually the Skyway. And if you'll notice, if you look closely, you've got 5 lanes asking for exact toll, and only 3 lanes one for cash and the others for the e-passes. Now, why am I showing you this? If you notice, despite the fact that there are 5 exact toll gates where you're supposed to not get any change, people are patronizing it. Okay, the lines are almost as long as the single line for cash only. And what does that tell you? That tells you simply this: now, when you're trying to get somewhere, nobody likes change because change slows you down. All right, that's what I wanted you to remember with this picture. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so we are in the middle of changes that we may or may not like, and we are in totally unfamiliar territory. Or are we? Or are these changes really new? I would say that not really. I'd say that we are looking at an old change that began some time ago, but it's being accelerated by a couple of new changes. All right, I'm talking about digital adaptation, and the 2 new changes that are coming in are better electronic funds transfer services and our favorite COVID-19 pandemic. All right. Now, are these presenting us with a threat or an opportunity? I'd say that depends on how we respond, and it would help us to understand how we got here in the first place. So let me begin by talking quickly about the old change, which is digital adaptation. Now, next slide, please. Now, this began quite some time ago. And what highlighted this, what heralded this really, is the rise of the smartphone. I won't go into how it evolved from a mobile phone combining and converging with a laptop to form what you have today in your pockets, which is a very powerful microcomputer. But you should know this, that all of us who carry this around with us, one, it's always on. We never turn it off, right? Two, we're never without it. If you left home and you were maybe, I don't know, 2-3 kilometers away, and you realize you left it behind, you'd probably turn around and come back and get it. So you can't be without it. Too much of your life is on it today. Next, it's connected to servers that deliver information and services anytime, anywhere, 24 hours a day. And lastly, people who hold this, including you and me, we access this X times a day, Y hours a day. What is X? X, based on the latest stats, is 300 times. Now you can do the math and see just how many times that is in a minute or in an hour. But 300 times a day is actually not far-fetched. Y hours a day, that is about 8 or 9 hours. And if you spend 16 hours of your time awake and sleep for 8, then 8 hours a day is half the time that you're awake. Okay? So that's the reality. Now, who are these people who are carrying this around? This is you, this is me, but more importantly, these are your clients, these are your employees, and these are your business partners. And they're ready to engage digitally, many of them. Just their usage of apps will tell you that. But how are you digitally engaging them? As you digitally engage them and you generate data, how are you using that data? And lastly, how is it making a difference, if you're doing this already, in the way you conduct your affairs? Because you don't do digital for the sake of digital. It's got to make a difference in your business. All right, so that's the old change. Now let's talk about the two new changes that are coming about. The first one, next slide, is better EFT services. Why is this important? Well, this is because we've been trying to do this for almost 25 years, trying to put in place peso same-day value transfer services that are reliable and that result in the beneficiary getting his funds on time in his account electronically without any deductions. So if I told myself I would pay Stephen today using InstaPay, then I could be sure, and this was not the case a few years ago, I could be sure that it would get to him today, right this moment when I finish, and he would get the full amount I'm trying to pay him. All right? And you may think that's not a big deal, but like I said, many countries have had this for a long time and we have not. And payments being one of the most important transactions that we do every day in the billions. This brings about a lot of opportunity for us now to leapfrog a lot of things that we used to do in the past that we can now execute more efficiently because it is now electronic. There's some stats there I put with regard to the difference between InstaPay and PesoNet, but not important. We can talk about that more if you'd like more details. All right, next slide, please. So we've seen digital, and will change. We've seen EFT, reliable, solid EFT, which all banks are following and participating in the rules of. And now we see the COVID-19 pandemic, and which has brought about our strange new normal. We're walking around wearing protective gear. We've seen public facilities redesigned. We've tried as much as possible to minimize physical interaction. And if you go out now, you see all these signs on the right of capacity limited to 10 people, closing early, keeping social distance, etc. We've all been driven, as our CEO said, to work from homes at the start of this. So we would work, play, shop, socialize, and even bank from home. And we're very thankful for that. Is that going to change now that GCQ is here? We think that because of all the friction that's being caused by what the pandemic has brought about by way of adaptation in the environment, this is going to be sticking around. This is not going to go away. People will prefer to do things like work, play, shop, socialize, and bank, if not from the comfort of their home, from the comfort of their office. And digital and logistics, as you'll see there in the middle, they've been going to the roof, both of these activities, simply because of that phenomenon. So as this happens, if you're a business that has not quite given your customers or your suppliers or your partners a way to interact with you financially that separates itself from physical contact, from having to move around a lot, then there could be a bit of disadvantage for you because, like I said, society is adapting to this very fast. Next slide, please. So the impact will essentially be, we've said, acceleration of digital adaptation, a change in customer behavior, and the need for us to adapt in working with our employees, in dealing with business partners, and engaging our customers. Have companies begun doing that already? Now, instead of going through tons of stats, there's just one slide I'd like to show you. Next slide, please, which is how much businesses have grown in terms of their use of a system called PesoNet, which is the preferred B2B channel when you're paying your suppliers, when you're paying business partners, etc. If you notice here, we've grown 175% from March to April, something we didn't expect. And what that is largely, we've gone through the numbers, we've taken a look at them. These are companies that have never used PesoNet before, but are now using them to, number one, pay suppliers. That's the main thing, okay? Others might be using it because they're counterparties for trading and things like that. But the main thing here is really payments to suppliers, which means they don't have to use checks anymore or cash or require suppliers to come to that. So yes, companies are adapting. And I'd like to tell you a little more about how they're doing that. Next slide, please. So you would start with your company, and your company would want to engage in, of course, you'd like to pay out your you make payments and you have receivables. You're probably paying, you need accounts, of course. Okay. You need accounts to make these payments, and you need to operate these accounts with documents, and traditionally you sign on these documents, your signatories. And you use these to pay, for example, first your employees, okay? Maybe you give them checks in the past. You'd also use these to pay suppliers. Maybe you'd ask them to come over and collect their checks. You'd also have customers coming to pay you checks, which you then will bring to a branch and deposit them. You'd also have customers paying you cash, and you'd have probably an armored car to pick it up. If not, you'd bring to the branch. All of these require you to interact with people, right? And require people to come to you. And it's not the ideal thing in this situation. So having said that, what can we do? All right. First thing I would do is I would tell you, put yourself in front of a computer. Let's look at semi-electronic funds management, okay? All right, and in place of your documents and your signatures, there's an electronic workflow that copies your board resolution exactly. Now, instead of paying your employees checks, you've done this maybe before, you credit their account. And why is InstaPay and PesoNet there? Because now you can actually credit employees' accounts no matter what bank they're in. All right, and the cost is minimal, so that can be done. They don't all have to be in one bank. As for your suppliers, same thing. You could probably use PesoNet, all right? And why PesoNet? Because again, it's the preferred B2B because there's no upper limit for that. You can credit their accounts directly. And I told you already, many companies are doing that. As for your customers, what you could do is instead of them, when they bring you checks, instead of bringing them to a branch to deposit them, you could scan images of those checks with a special scanner, and you could send that to the bank, to us, and we could deposit those checks based simply on the images, okay? And that, of course, precludes you from having to go to the bank and make trips there just to make those deposits, you or your employees. Now, as for cash, what you can do, what we've done for a lot of companies, is we've actually placed a machine on their premises called a cash acceptance machine or a remote deposit machine, where cash is put into it, like an ATM, but cash goes in instead of out. It recognizes all the bills rapidly, and then it drops them into a safe underneath, and transmits how much cash it successfully recognized. Whereas when we get that, we credit your account. Okay. So again, that prevents you from having to go out and bring the cash to the bank. If your armored car is coming to pick it up, that prevents or that makes it a lot less frequent for the armored car to come and pick it up. It only comes over when the machine is full, and yet you get full benefit of your cash in your account. But there's still a lot of interaction going on here. So let's move on and try and get rid of all the interaction that we're seeing with people. Okay. So now let's move to fully electronic funds management, where instead of that, now we have three options. And the first is client-initiated payments. Now, if we take a look at what that is, the yellow box, the screen would look something like this. Okay, come on. All right, so this is an example of an e-banking system that allows its customers of that bank to pay you through InstaPay and PesoNet or credit you directly, all right? Really, asking them to come to a branch of your bank and deposit a check over the counter and fax you, or sorry, send you a copy of the deposit slip, that's going to be gone, all but gone with InstaPay and PesoNet. So that's one way they could do it. E-banking portals is another way that they could pay you without ever having to bring you checks or cash. And what that would look like is this. This is actually the e-billing portal of a bank, of RCBC, where you could enroll your company here. And once it's done, users of our electronic banking system can actually choose your company if they want to pay you, enter the data that you want to see, their reference number, their policy number, their account number with you, and the amount, and we would forward that to you. We would credit that to your account, okay? All right, so that is the bills payment option. The last one I'd like to talk about is payment at your website. So if you have a website, and that's not hard to come by these days, we could actually put up a e-commerce acquisition facility right inside your website. And what that would do is open up payments for stuff that you're selling to anyone who has a MasterCard or a Visa, whether it's a credit card, a debit card, a prepaid card. Once we set this up in there, all your customers can pay you using any of those cards. So after having done all that, in effect, what we've done is, if we could go back now to the inside. What we've done, if you take a look at this diagram, is we've really taken out interaction. Everything is really done electronically from the cooperative process of your board resolution. All right. So just to summarize and close this presentation. Yes, okay. I'd like to simply say this. First of all, there are already digital applications in financial management. You probably used them already. They've been around for a while. These have been accelerated by EFT services that are now uniform and reliable. And the COVID-19 pandemic has likewise accelerated this and made things very different. It's forcing everyone to digitally adapt. Your customers, your employees, and maybe it's something that you should look at very seriously. We likewise benefit from digital, I have to admit that, because it makes our own internal processes much easier. We do things electronically instead of having to work with paper, and that saves us a lot of cost. And so we're very happy to help you make the transition if you'd like to do that. And be ready to take a screenshot, because what I'll do next is show you who it is that you can contact in RCBC to help you with. So there it is. Contact any of these four individuals, myself included, in the upper left, and we'll be very happy to take a look at what you can do to adapt to the situation and move ahead in spite of the difficulties of COVID-19. All right, and that ends my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sir Manny. Personally, I am not a techie person, but I love these solutions that you've shown. I'm actually a heavy user of these digital payment facilities. Right now, we're actually entering the phase, our Q&A part. And I hope Mike is ready because we already have some questions on the line. First question from our client. Mike, can you kindly give us a bit of an explanation how these actions of central banks have actually generated demand?
Well, actually, these are really learning from the past crisis periods. Well, learning well, especially during the global financial crisis and about more than a decade ago. And of course, they have already leveled up in terms of managing the economy, nursing it back in recovery mode. So they have cut interest rates. They have infused so much liquidity through quantitative easing measures. In fact, a lot of central banks in developed countries, particularly in the US, in Europe, and in Japan, they have committed unlimited amounts of infusions of liquidity, open-ended quantitative easing, meaning bond purchases. So they will never run out of ammunition. So it has effectively further, because right now key interest rates in developed countries are either zero or close to zero. So that's already exhausted that monetary easing measure by way of interest rate cuts. So quantitative easing, or the purchase of bonds and other liquidity infusions by the central banks, would help reduce further borrowing costs. In fact, some countries, even prior to COVID-19, like Japan, Germany, some other European countries, they already have negative interest rates. That's one way to make sure that it would encourage or even incentivize the borrowers to take out loans, meaning the businesses as well as households to take out or get housing loans, auto loans, and then businesses also, they would borrow a lot because of cheaper financing costs, create more investments, generate more jobs. So that's one way to nurse back the economies and accelerate the rebound or the recovery, as we have seen a decade ago. And now, of course, they have a learning curve to that. They have done a great job. Not only that, not only on the real economy, the excess liquidity is helping the gains in the financial markets. We have seen the bond yields or interest rate going down significantly. There's so much money made by investors, so much savings by the borrowers when they borrow. Some of the money also went to the equities market, searching for higher returns, and hopefully in other asset classes as well. So that's a sure way to ensure the sustainability of the recovery. So even the local central bank is also, they have done quite a lot of measures, even non-conventional measures, like incentivizing banks to lend, increase or encourage lending, especially to the MSMEs, to the agriculture sector, as well as practically to the households and to everybody else. At least businesses, they would have a lifeline when they need it to keep jobs, and for those with deeper pockets to borrow more, invest more, create more jobs and other business opportunities that would mitigate the economic contraction due to COVID-19 and also limit or mitigate the risk of recession.
All right, thank you very much for that, Mike. Another question, Mike. I guess this question relates to the disconnect somehow that some people are seeing. We've seen that stock markets have recovered quite a lot. In fact, for some stock markets, they've gone back to pre-COVID levels. There's this disconnect, and some people are doubting, and they're saying the current level of stocks right now versus the expectations on earnings don't quite jive. What can you say about this, and how can you explain the disconnect?
Well, the disconnect is it's already glaring recently, especially before. Well, we just saw a correction for the past week or so, but prior to that, wow, these levels are back to pre-COVID-19. Like, yeah, true. There's a disconnect because, like, for instance, locally, the local stock market before the lockdowns were ranging between 7,000 to 7,500. Now, uh, we have seen a high of close to 7,000 a few days ago. So even investors, they would, especially those who still have positions even prior to COVID-19 lockdown, they may rationalize. It's normal for them to rationalize and say, "Hi, that it may be too soon in terms of valuations for these levels in the market, given these hefty gains, to go back to pre-COVID-19 levels." So tendency, those who have been stuck with their positions early on before COVID-19, they would try to rationalize and lighten up a bit, because it's like giving them the second big chance to do so when they miss the chance to lighten up, especially at the height of COVID-19. And those who have been making so much money already for the past 2 to 3 months, well, ranging between 20, 30, or even 40%, those really took were lucky enough to come in at a little over 4,000 already, making 50%. So they would tend to, they'll be happy already to lock in some of the gains. And as a result of that, there's this healthy consolidation. So it's partly because of rational expectations, meaning because it's liquidity driven, by the way. It's similar to what we have seen because there's so much money or liquidity being infused into the system. So the gains are liquidity driven. So at some point, there's a need to rationalize and to put more perspective from the part of the investors, especially if the time is already ripe for them to lock in some gains and wait for it to consolidate again. It would be a timing element before further gains would be sustained.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Mike. And I remember back in 2008, the action of major central banks was really very different compared to now. What we've seen in the recent past as far as central bank action has been very swift, and huge amounts of liquidity was put in a very short period of time. And I think that is why Mike noted a while ago the immense amount of liquidity in the system. And if you add that to his statement a while ago regarding the level of interest rates, I think that somehow adds to the fuel of why there's been a very active participation in the stock markets, not only locally, but actually more so internationally, where stock markets have really performed and beaten even the fixed income markets. Mike, my next question to you is, can you tell us something about the yield curve control? This has been going around in the market along with, and add to that, Mike, if you could, talk about negative interest rates. Why is this a good option? Why is this not a good option?
Well, at least for the yield curve control, there's been talk about it actually about more than a week ago. As a result, we saw a sudden uptick in the 10-year US government bond yield, or the US Treasury bond yield benchmark. It came from 0.60. It went up to close to 1% at 0.90 levels at some point more than a week ago. But now it has gone down again. It's now back to 0.7 levels. So, of course, that is still controversial, as the Fed has signaled also in terms of managing the yield curve. Because well, now, these are different and extraordinary times. There's so much liquidity. So because of the excess liquidity that is driving the market, so there may be some valuations may be kind of altered in such a way that there's some exuberance at some point because there's so much money chasing a finite amount of investments. So sometimes they sometimes like for in the bond markets, there's tendency for like the valuation should be inflation, but it's for a lot of developed countries, the bond yields and interest rates are already way below inflation. So that's already negative interest rate environment we're talking about. So that's essentially that should be managed properly because actually for some countries it has been lingering for quite some time that those negative interest rate environment or even negative net interest rate return, especially if interest rates, if you net inflation and also if you net that with the taxes that must be paid on interest income. So that's actually the textbook or the fundamental approach, meaning investors should be properly compensated especially for the effects of inflation on their money. Now, there are exceptions because central banks, they tend to distort that. If they buy unlimited amount of funds, so they bid down the yields, they bid up the price. So there you go. There's already a scenario of negative interest rates. If you look at Japan, Germany, because it is the price is artificially driven by the central banks through this quantitative easing, and it's even open-ended on their part, unlimited on their part, by especially in the US, some parts of Europe, and also in Japan. So their objective is that's how desperate they are, just to ensure that the recovery will take hold. Meaning economic conditions are really soft in those countries. So the way to do it, even if they have to pay borrowers, because it's negative interest rates, that's the irony of it all. You imagine you borrow, then you will even be paid. And if you're an investor, given the negative interest rates, you have to pay for safekeeping your money. So that is, well, there you go. That's the distortion of the yield curve in view of this quantitative easing. Of course, the penultimate objective is to spur greater economic activities because the borrowers would be happy, businesses would be more than happy to borrow, invest a lot, create more business opportunities, generate more jobs. Even the households, they would take out more loans. Well, in fact, in the US, we've seen the highest in 11 years for take up of mortgages or housing loans lately. Because they're encouraged to borrow and able to finance their purchase of property. And we all know that real estate has a high multiplier effect because the construction workers that they hire, the building materials, and many other, even hundreds of industries that would benefit if there's a boom in construction and the purchases of homes.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. And definitely, if there's anything that we can credit these central banks is they continue to learn. There is no textbook for what we are seeing right now, and similar to what happened in 2008, central banks there were also learning how to deal with a crisis, and that's the same thing we're seeing now. And they're actually using new tools to try and control and ensure rather that the economies will have a fighting chance to recover. I'd like to go back, Mike, to the Philippines. 4.9 million Filipinos have been reported to have lost their jobs. Unemployment at 17.7%. But we all know that we have a very big informal economy. Where do you think true unemployment really is?
Well, if you notice that's way the unemployment rate of 17%. That's way beyond or way higher than expectations in the market. But of course, it's more of a technicality more than anything else because here in the Philippines, when people stop working, they don't earn wages or salaries, they don't have income. So they're technically counted or part of the unemployed. That explains the increase of 5 million number of unemployed people. Unlike in other countries, like going to the US and in Europe, well, they have been subsidizing those who weren't able to work. Like for instance, in the US, those who weren't able to work are paid $600 per week. So that has become an issue, as pointed out by Federal Reserve Chairman Powell. Their propensity or their willingness to go back to work because they're already making so much because of the government subsidies. But we all know that this is temporary. It will only last for a few weeks. So that makes it different. Even in Europe, in UK, there's a subsidy of maybe, and even in Canada, a subsidy of maybe close to 70 or 80% of their salaries being given by the government, of course, to their respective companies, so that employees, even if they don't report for work, would continue receiving their salaries or wages. So, but all of those are temporary, are stopgap measures, those rollouts, just to tie them over for the time at the height of the lockdowns. So that's why their unemployment rates were much lower because of that technicality. Those people receiving this wage or salary subsidies were not counted as part of the unemployment rate. But we have to note that the latest data here in the Philippines, that's as of April, that's already the worst. Because that's the height of the lockdown. That's the height of the ECQ in Metro Manila and for the rest of Luzon. That's a full month. We only saw the easing of the ECQ by starting May 16 to MECQ. And it was all eased further to GCQ starting June 1. So hopefully by then, there technically more people, there will be an increasing number of people going back to work. They'll again earn their salaries, their wages. So we would see already some easing of the unemployment rate. That's the worst data as of April. Well, that's already the highest for the unemployment rate. It would gradually ease in the coming months as more businesses are reopened. But of course, expectations-wise, for the coming months, since the recovery would be gradual, given the social distancing measures, and of course, there are still constraints like some limitations on public transport. So it would ease, but it would remain relatively elevated for the unemployment rate.
All right. Follow-up question on that, Mike. Regarding the most affected parts of our economy, do you believe that the fiscal steps undertaken by the government have been successful in reaching the targeted sectors of the economy?
Well, at least that in terms of timing, at the speed at which they were able to deliver or to execute, or meaning to deploy, especially the social amelioration, in fairness, it's rather quick. They were kind of decisive about it. They spent a total of 200 billion for the next 2 months, especially at the time of the ECQ. And they've done it in tranches. And at the same time, well, it was rapid. It was something that's, of course, there may be some logistical issues and constraints that came along, but nonetheless, it was fairly quick. But that's already the limit, because more than a month ago, well, even now, the resources are already limited. So the people will go back to work and rely less on that. But ideally, of course, if we look at our other countries, Taiwan, they were able to manage their they were able to contain properly. Even Vietnam, the number of infections were relatively low, and the new infections were also, well, it's also very minimal. And the likes of Taiwan, they were able, well, they continued, the economy almost never stopped. It still continues. Oh, well, what's the reason for this? Because and there are similar scenarios in other Asian countries. Well, what's the rationale for this? Because they already have the experience. They had bird flu for the past 20 years from time to time, especially other East Asian countries. They had SARS around in 2003. That was 17 years ago. So they already built up their capability in terms of their healthcare systems, their preparedness, the equipment, the PPEs, the masks. So it's all there. And all the other stringent measures, like the social distancing measures, have been well trained about it for quite some time. Unlike here in the Philippines, it's the first time. It's practically the first time that this kind of pandemic happened. So maybe now their focus really is on, especially even now, for many other countries in Asia, those who have been doing well, they're focusing on the testing side and the tracing. So that has been their focus, alongside, of course, with measures like the wearing of masks. There are stiff fines if they violate those, if they violate some of those, etc. That's why that explains the relatively low number of COVID-19 cases in their respective areas.
All right. Contraction, transition, and recovery. The data that we're seeing right now seems to be showing that there has been an improvement in the economic figures that we're seeing. So, for instance, if we look at the U.S., they just registered in May a 2.5 million jobs growth, a 17.7% rise in retail sales. But the question that we want to hear is, definitely this is more part of a transition type of a figure, wherein you're coming from a very low base, and now with all the inputs and the resources put in by governments, you're getting a bit of a recovery. But the last phase, which is the recovery phase, when do you think we should be starting to feel and get a better read whether the data we're seeing is more part of the recovery phase or whether it is still part of the transition phase?
Well, now at least one thing is for sure now. We have seen and we're already done with the worst of the lockdowns, and also alongside with it, the worst in the data. At least the cutoff of that as of April. So there would already be, well, name it. We have the imports data, exports, manufacturing, employment, as well as other growth indicators. So that's April, because at the height of the lockdown. So starting May, it was already relaxed, and further relaxed come June. Now it's status quo till the end of the month for a lot of areas. So, but of course, if you are to be pragmatic about it, right now the recovery is still relatively slow, meaning capacities are still relatively low. And that shows also in various industries that are only allowed as well less than 50% capacity, and in so many workplaces at the same time. And also the constraints in public transportation that's reducing productivity at very low levels at the moment. In terms of if you try to assess the overall, what's the capacity utilization right now of the full economy? Okay, fine. Let them have claimed that 75% of the economy may be already open. But if you look at the capacities of many other businesses, well, some businesses are operating between 30 or even close to 50%. So those are the realities right now, and hopefully it would gradually pick up in the coming months. And same goes. It's not just only us. The reopening of the economies are accelerating also in many other countries, especially the biggest countries in the world, like the US and Europe. And the only risk that we have to face now would be a second round or a new round of COVID-19 infections, if this would become a threat. Realistically, that's part of the reopening. There may be some pickup, but hopefully it won't be considered as a threat yet. So, and also it would be a function also of the development of a vaccine. The top health officials in the U.S. already estimated that the earliest development of a vaccine would be around November to December of this year. Hopefully that would, if that is indeed developed and rolled out, so that would help sustain. But for now, we're looking 1 to 2 years at least without any new wave, well, for the whole economy before we return to pre-COVID levels. So that would be the minimum. But again, for other industries like tourism, those who were hard hit, those involving crowds or maybe adversely affected by social distancing, maybe around 3 years. Even IATA acknowledged the global travel industry, the global airlines, it would take around 3 years before they see a return to pre-COVID levels. So those are the realities right now. But one thing is for sure, we're picking up. So it would be a matter of course should the recovery accelerate. We have first the two pillars of the economic recovery program is the increased infrastructure project. If that accelerates, that's going to help, and also the CREATE bill. If that is tackled by Congress upon reopening by August, hopefully to be implemented by September or October. So that would help, being the biggest stimulus measure by the government.
Yeah, I guess you take the data as it is, right? And yes, definitely the data has been good, but I think it's also safe or wise to take the warning also of the Fed, where he noted that he hopes that the fiscal support of government is not artificially or abruptly removed, because right now I think we should be looking at whether we will indeed get a sustained recovery in the two main pillars of the economy, which is labor and consumption. Let's move on now, Mike, to the second part of your presentation, which is on the CREATE bill. What's the difference between this one and the CITIRA bill?
Well, CITIRA, CITIRA it's normally the schedule of the tax cuts there would take longer. Initially, it was planned to be for the next 10 years. It would be a total of 10 percentage point reduction from 30% to 20%, meaning that would be by 2030. But now they tweaked it. They made it more palatable as being the biggest stimulus measure. Right away, this year, we'll see a cut of 5 percentage points in the corporate income tax rate to 25% right away from 30%. So, and the next phase would be also, they will try to accelerate it to 20% by 2027. So that's earlier by 3 years, on top of the big lump of decline for this year. And at the same time, also the extension of the sunset provisions by 2 years, as well as the NOLCO extended by 2 years to 5 years from 3 years. So that would really help local businesses, especially the corporations, as well as the foreign investors. So it would address many issues that have been pending for the past 1 to 2 years under CITIRA. And that would be the biggest stimulus measure. We all know the government has constraints on funding stimulus. So what would be now the emerging consensus on top of the CREATE bill? Now the 1.3, there might be compromises on the proposed stimulus package of 1.3 trillion. So what they're planning right now is to stagger it, maybe for the next 2 to 3 years. Because now the government can only afford up to 180 billion. So that would be the emerging consensus. So those two drivers, plus the third one, increased infrastructure spending. That is, the budget for infrastructure has been already raised. So for the next 2 to 3 years. So those three pillars hopefully would accelerate the economic recovery and rebound, going back towards the pre-COVID-19 levels. Hopefully we'll get it in 1 to 2 years at the earliest.
Okay. 1.3 billion versus 180 billion available funds. That's a pretty big gap you have there. And I guess that explains why the government's saying that we cannot afford the package right now. Question, Mike, how does this tax rate compare to the region?
Well, that's a very good point, Stephen. Even for the past 1 to 2 years, with the earlier version of the Cetera bill, it has been pointed out that there's indeed a need to reduce the Philippines corporate income taxes because because the 30% corporate income tax is still among the highest in Asia. Unlike in other countries, some countries in the region are just about half of which, no? So the target of 20%, more or less, that's already closer to the region. But there are many other countries that are at a little over, well, maybe between 15 to 20%. So more or less, it has been long overdue, actually, so to speak. The need to further bring down. Why there's the need to bring down? Primarily because that's one way to attract more foreign investments into the country. Maybe there are other structural issues like also easing the foreign ownership limits, but that would be kind of difficult to some extent, especially if it's part of the constitution that would require charter change, which is not realistic for the past 20 to 30 years. So that's it. It's really more of for many years already. That's already overdue for our corporate income taxes to be reduced.
Right. Well, definitely that is a step in the right direction. We hope that eventually it will attract foreign investors because that's one thing we so direly need. There are no questions anymore in the pipeline, so I would like to introduce, to wrap the economic briefing, I would like to welcome the Head of Corporate Banking, Group Head, Ms. Beth Coronel.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this afternoon's briefing. As mentioned earlier, this is the second time corporate banking is hosting this event since the pandemic started. As we promised, we want to do this regularly so we can constantly update you. By now, a lot of us have started on the road to reopening our businesses, which somehow took a pause. We all know the destination that we want to reach, and that is for things to reach a certain level of normal, whatever kind of normal that is. But we don't know how long and winding that road will be. Our corporate bankers have been tasked to be in constant discussion with you so we can determine what you need in order to traverse this road. Some of you may need to be carried. Some may just need an umbrella. Some may even just need to have a companion to walk with. Whatever it is, we are here to help you, and we'll continue to work with you during these difficult and challenging times. We are just a call, a text message, or a Zoom meeting away. Thank you very much, and please stay safe.